Okay, welcome all for this session on topology geometry and of the 2020 workshop. I can't beat Tangavelu's joke, so I will not try to make one. So we'll start with Tejas Kalelkar from IISER Pune, who has some IISc connection. Part of his graduate student work was in IISc. And so he'll be talking about recognizing, in fact, homeomorphism problem for hyperbolic manifolds.
Yeah, thank you, Siddharth. Yeah, let me just make it explicit. Siddharth was my advisor, so it's great to have him as the chair of my session. So thanks to everyone for showing up. I realize that 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning is not an easy talk to attend. So thank you for everyone who's here. I want to talk about an algorithm to recognize hyperbolic manifolds. And as Siddharth pointed out, the aim over here is that if you're given two constant curve which are manifolds, either spherical or Euclidean or hyperbolic, the aim is to figure out whether the two manifolds are the same or not. That's essentially the aim of this talk. At least one algorithm to give a solution to this problem. This is joined with my students Advait and Sriram. And to begin with, so when you talk about a manifold, there are many different ways of expressing a manifold. And one of the simplest combinatorial ways of expressing it is via a triangulation. So particularly if it's a smooth manifold, then you have triangulations for it. And you can just describe the manifold by essentially telling how these tetrahedra or simplexes kind of stick together. So it's just kind of a Lego brick kind of a structure, and you just care about the combinatorics of it. And if you approach manifolds in this way, then the basic question is what's called the homeomorphism problem, which says that if you have the combinatorial data of two triangulations K1 and K2 of manifolds M and N, then the question is there an algorithm to determine whether M and N are homeomorphic from the combinatorial data of the triangulation? So just from the triangulation, can you determine whether the two corresponding manifolds you can ask when you're working with triangulated manifolds? Now, this question in general, of course, has no solution. So Markov showed that this homeomorphism problem is unsolvable in dimension more than 3. In dimension 3, because there is so much additional structure, there are a few algorithms to solve this homeomorphism problem. The classic algorithm was pioneered by Haken, and there's something called a Haken hierarchy. So I don't want to spend too much time on it, but the way I would visualize it is in one dimension lower. If you imagine, start out with a surface, essential curve on the surface, and you cut along this essential curve. When you cut along this essential curve, you end up with, in quote, simpler pieces of the surface, right? And then you can repeat this process. Now you cut along properly embedded arcs or essential curves. And the point is that in finitely many steps, this pieces get simpler and simpler to the point where they just become polygons. So you end up with a bunch of polygons and a gluing data on how to reconstruct the original surface. And something similar can be done in dimension 3, where you start with a triangulated manifold, and there is a algorithmic way to come up with surfaces along which you cut, what are called incompressible surfaces, which are the pi1 injective surfaces. You come up with this collection of possible collections of pi1 injective surfaces, and then you cut along these surfaces till you end up with balls, and this essentially gives you a cell decomposition. So there is a way to bound the length of this hierarchy in terms of the number of tetrahedra, and you look at all possible hierarchies of this certain bound.
Tejas,
yes.
So this incompressible surfaces, you can identify them from the triangulation. It's extra data.
No. You can identify from the triangulation. So basically, from the triangulation is something called normal surfaces. You essentially you give coordinates to these surfaces in terms of the way they intersect the different tetrahedra. And these coordinates end up being the fundamental solutions of a set of linear equations. So it's not too hard to come up with these possible surfaces.
Okay,
so
thanks.
It's not a data you need to start with. You just need the data of the triangulation. That's it. Yeah. So yeah, and of course, I should point out this is a gross simplification. I mean, of course, algorithm is far more complicated. So Haken gave this algorithm, and it was for most cases except for surface bundles over a circle, which was completed by Hemyon, who gave the solution for the conjugacy class problem for mapping class groups. And using that, you could solve this problem also for surface bundles over a circle. And then these algorithms and some gaps were filled in by Matveyev, and he's written a beautiful book about this. So, I mean, the algorithm really stretches out over more than 100 pages in the book. So it's clearly not something that's a simple one to implement. It's, in my way of looking at it, it's more of a theoretical algorithm where you want to show that the algorithm exists. And of course, if it's an algorithm, as that points out, you can implement it, but it will certainly be very difficult to implement. And there are no complexity bounds for such an algorithm. So this is from a purely topological approach. But in dimension 3, we have a lot more structure. So we have this whole geometrization.
I should clarify though, this is for Haken manifolds. Because of geometrization, we can extend
Yes.
it to everything.
Yes,
You
yes.
have to throw in the Rubinstein
Yeah,
algorithm and patch things out.
Precisely. Yes, yes, yes. Of course, of course. So this is like, I want to kind of distinguish it. This is for topological manifolds. So a large class of topological manifolds are what I call Haken manifolds, where you have such surfaces that you can cut along to start with. If you don't have anything to start with, then of course you can't process this algorithm at all. But via geometrization, you can look at cases which have these cases and deal separately with those which are non-Haken. So because of geometrization, so geometrization is this sort of this big theorem that is, a huge part of it for Haken manifolds was done by Thurston, and the proof was completed for all manifolds by Perelman. And what this says is that you start out with any 3 manifold, and then you can cut it along this canonical collection of spheres and tori's in such a way that you end up with simpler pieces. And these pieces are simple in the sense that all of them have one of 8 possible geometries. These are called the Thurston geometries. So there are parts of this algorithm. I haven't listed all of them, just sort of the ones that I came across: Jacob, Bézier, Porty, Manning, Zella, etc. And different parts of this, basically breaking it up into the irreducible pieces, the GST decomposition, the cutting up along a tori, so that decomposition, then recognizing the different 8 possible geometries. And once you've recognized the geometry of the piece, how do you see that 2 pieces of the same geometry are in fact the same manifold or not? So there are lots of different algorithms which go into it. Scott and Short have a nice paper on the homomorphism problem where they combine all these algorithms, and they use Manning's algorithm instead of Stella, where they say it's a little more efficient in that sense. And also the important thing about the paper is that they only use the statement of the geometrization, not the ideas which go into it. So in that sense, it's a nice, neat paper to look at for the homomorphism problem in dimension 3. But again, this is an algorithm which is very difficult to implement, and there are certainly no complexity bounds. Now, in the direction of complexity bounds, there's a paper by Cooperberg recently, I think in the last 10 years, where he shows that the computational complexity, it is essentially bounded by a function of the number of tetrahedra. That's what he was really aiming for, that it's a bounded runtime algorithm where the bound is in terms of the number of tetrahedra. So this is what he was aiming for. In particular, he shows that the computational complexity is essentially a bounded tower of exponentials. So the complexity is of the kind 2 raised to 2 raised to 2 raised to 2, and there is this tower of 2s. Whole things, and at the top you have t, which is the number of tetrahedra. He doesn't give a bound on the length of this, height of this tower, but he says that, this is kind of what the complexity looks like. So the aim, of course, here is to show that there is a bounded running time in terms of the number of tetrahedra. So it's not yet an explicit bound, but it's in that direction. And the aim, of course, we want to get to is an explicit bound for the number of, for the running time for such an algorithm, for the homomorphism problem. Be done in to an n disk on the boundary of an n+1 simplex. Then a Pachner move on D replaces D with its complement on the boundary of the n+1 simplex. Okay, so it's quite a big definition to take in, but it's actually. So let's see what's happening in dimension 2. So in dimension 2, if you look at, I don't think I have a marker over here.
Sorry, Tejas, one stupid question.
Yeah.
What in this algorithm are you counting? What things are you counting at unit cost, as in multiplication of arbitrary size numbers, division? What is the model of computation?
So here the number of top dimensional simplexes. That is essentially the data on which I'm looking at the complexity.
No, as in what operations can your computer do in 1 second? Like, can it multiply numbers or divide numbers? That's my question.
So in the Cooperberg thing, he actually talks about Pachner moves as a unit, if I remember right.
Okay.
Yeah. So these Packner moves are very local combinatorial changes that you're making to the triangulation. So this is what I want to get to. Okay, so in dimension 2, what this definition of the what this definition says is you look at the bottom of this three-dimensional simplex, that is just one triangle. And if you look at the disk on the top, that is three triangles. So basically, one of the possible two-dimensional Packner moves is where you replace one triangle with three of them. I don't know, can you see my cursor?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I can just point with that. So if you look at this triangle at the bottom, this has been replaced by the disk on the top, which consists of three triangles. So that is, so this is kind of what to keep in the background. And really what's happening on the triangulation of the surface is you've taken one triangle and split it into three triangles. Or you could have the reverse direction where you start with three triangles sharing a vertex and you end up with one triangle. So this is one possible Packner move. Another possible Packner move is where you look at the two triangles on the top of the tetrahedron and you look at the two triangles on the bottom of the tetrahedron, replace one disk with the other, which corresponds in two dimensions to just flipping the diagonal. So that's a 2-2 move where you take two triangles and you replace it with the two triangles obtained by flipping the diagonal. And these are the only possible two-dimensional Packner moves. Now in dimension 3, of course, I can't draw a four-dimensional simplex, but it's easy to see that there are again just four possible Packner moves in dimension 3, one of which is the corresponding to the 1-3 and 3-1 move that we talked about in dimension 2. So you take a tetrahedron, split it into four tetrahedra, or in the reverse direction, start with four tetrahedra and you just combine them together to make one tetrahedra. Or you could have taken two tetrahedra which share a face and you split it into three tetrahedra which share this common edge. So if you look at the join, the convex hull of this gray edge along with this edge, that gives you one tetrahedron. This one with the other edge gives you the second tetrahedron, and this with the third edge gives you the third tetrahedron. So you've broken up two simplexes, you remove this face in common and you split it into three simplexes. Now, this of course works in higher dimensions, you have more Packner moves, but the point is that in every dimension, it is a finite local set of moves, local set of changes that you're making to the triangulation. And the reason these Packner moves are important is because of this theorem of Packner, which says that if you have two PL triangulations of an n-dimensional manifold with P and Q many n simplexes and a common subdivision, then K1 is related to K2 by a finite sequence of Packner moves. So given any two triangulations of this same manifold, you can go from one to the other by just making these local changes along the way. And in finitely many steps, you can start out with K1 and end up with K2. Okay. So this is a very important theorem because it allows us, for example, to come up with invariants for the manifold. So if I want to say that a certain property of the manifold is invariant for a triangulated manifold, I can define that invariant using a triangulation, and then I show that this property does not change under these Packner moves. If I do that, then it is a property which is true, although it is defined in terms of the triangulation, it does not really depend on the choice of triangulation because any two of them are related by Packner moves and Packner move does not change this property. So Packner moves are extremely important in studying PL manifolds. And the reason it comes up in this context of the homeomorphism problem is because obtaining a bound on the length of this sequence needed to go from K1 to K2 is equivalent to solving the homeomorphism problem. Okay, so let me elaborate on this statement. So FNPQ is a bound on the number of Packner moves needed to go from a triangulation with P n simplexes to a triangulation with Q n simplexes. N is the dimension of the manifold. P and Q are the number of top dimensional simplexes in the triangulation. So suppose I have such a bounding function that I give you P and Q, triangulations with P simplexes, triangulations with Q n simplexes. And I know that I can go from one to the other by at most F Packner moves. Okay, so I have such a bounding function. In that case, I claim that I can solve the homeomorphism problem. And the way I would do this is I start out with two manifolds M and N, and I'm given two triangulations, Km and Kn. And I want to figure out whether M and N are homeomorphic or not. And the way I would do this now is I would construct a list of triangulations. So I look at all possible triangulations of M, which can be obtained from the starting initial triangulation given to me Km by at most F many Packner moves. Okay, so I construct this whole list, what I've called kappa over here. This is a list of all triangulations of M, which can be obtained from Km by at most F many Packner moves. Okay, so I look at this, I first of all make this collection, and then I make this claim that M is homeomorphic to N if and only if some triangulation in this list is simplicially isomorphic to the triangulation for Kn. the triangulation n that is given to me. Okay. And simplicial isomorphism is a very simple object. I just say, is there a bijection between the vertices such that simplexes on the left correspond to simplexes on the image? That's all I'm comparing. So this I can compare it on a just at a combinatorial level by looking at all the possible triangulations of this kappa and comparing each of them with the triangulation Kn.
There's just a bit of a quibble, but you should say computable F. F always exists
yes,
because it's finite, but it has to be computable.
Yes. So F is a explicit function of N, P, and Q. That's what I mean over here. Yeah, so it's certainly computable. Yeah, so let me just explain this in one direction. Yeah, and the other direction is actually what Siddharth is pointing out, and maybe I'll talk a little about the other direction as well. Okay, so suppose I know, so how do I justify such a claim? So suppose M is homomorphic to N. Okay, so suppose there is this homomorphism G from M to N. And I want to claim that there is some triangulation in this list kappa, which is simplicially isomorphic to Kn. So what I would do is look at G inverse of Kn. This is a different triangulation of M with Q many simplexes. And therefore, it should be related to Km by at most F many Pachner moves. And therefore, G inverse Kn must be one of the elements in kappa. And if you look at the map G itself, then G is a simplicial isomorphism from G inverse Kn to Kn. So that gives me a simplicial isomorphism. Conversely, of course, if I have a simplicial isomorphism between a triangulation of M and a triangulation of N, then a simplicial isomorphism is a homomorphism and therefore M is homomorphic to N. Okay. So that shows that if I have a bounding function, then in fact, I can solve the homomorphism problem. The converse is also true, which is where this comment about computability comes in, but maybe to save time, I won't get into that. I'm really interested in only the forward, maybe at the end of the lecture, I'll talk a little about that. I'm only interested in the forward direction. So if I have a computable explicit function F, which gives me a bound in the number of Pachner moves, then I can solve the homomorphism problem. So all of this kind of stuff here is really just to emphasize that it's important to understand the homomorphism, important to get a bound on the length of this Pachner sequence. Okay, so in this direction, Mijatovic has a result which says that you do have such a bound in dimension 3 for a large class of 3 manifolds, not for all of them, but for all manifolds where the complement of the characteristic submanifold does not fiber over the circle. So at least for a very large class of 3 manifolds, which includes hyperbolic manifolds, you do have such a bound on the number of Pachner moves. And this bound is, as you can see, it's not a small bound. It's 2 raised to 2 raised to 2, and the height of this tower is 2 raised to 162p. So on the one hand, it's great to have an explicit bound. That's what we were looking for. On the other hand, it's not so great in the sense that it's not practical in any sense of the word, right? It's such a massive bound. So the question we asked ourselves is, really we're interested in hyperbolic manifolds. And our question is, can you get a sharper bounding function for the number of Pachner moves needed to relate geometric triangulations of constant curvature n-dimensional manifolds? So on the one hand, we are looking at not just 3 manifolds, we're looking at all n-dimensional manifolds. On the other hand, we're restricting our attention only to spherical, Euclidean, or hyperbolic manifolds. And the biggest restriction is that we are working only with geometric triangulations. So we're looking at hyperbolic triangulations of hyperbolic manifolds, spherical triangulations of spherical manifolds, and Euclidean triangulations of Euclidean manifolds. So this is the setting that we are in, and we want to construct a bounding function on the number of Pachner moves needed to relate to such geometric triangulations. And the result that we have, so it's a long statement. This is my student. I'll just read it through first. Let M be a closed spherical Euclidean or hyperbolic n-dimensional manifold with geometric triangulations K1 and K2. Let K1 and K2 have P and Q many n-dimensional simplexes. Let lambda be an upper bound on the lengths of edges. When M is spherical, we require lambda to be less than or equals pi by 2. That's the technicality. Let inj M denote the injectivity radius of M. When n is less than or equal to 4, then K1 and K2 are related by F many Pachner moves. In general, their 2 raised to n plus 1 barycentric subdivisions are related by F many Pachner moves. And this bound F is a function of n, the dimension of the manifold, P and Q, the number of n simplexes, lambda, which is an upper bound on lengths of edges, and the injectivity radius of the manifold. Okay, the exact function is this 2 raised to n plus 2 into n plus 1 factorial raised to 4 plus 3m, and m again is a function of lambda, the injectivity radius, and n. And in particular, in terms of the simplexes, it is just cubic polynomial of the simplexes. Okay, so we have a bound which is cubic in the number of simplexes, but it is doubly exponential in the lengths on the bound on the length of the edges. Now, this is a good theorem, but what you are really going for is something which depends only on the triangulation of the manifold. So this dependence on the injectivity radius of the M is kind of jarring because we don't really know anything about the manifold. We are just given the triangulations. Fortunately, the injectivity radius for constant curvature manifolds is bounded below in terms of the volume and the diameter. And the volume and the diameter can again be bounded in terms of this N, P, Q, and the lengths on edges. So we have the corollary of the kind that we were looking for. So I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's essentially the same statement as a theorem, but now the bound is in terms of N, P, Q, and upper and lower bounds on the lengths of edges. So just given the combinatorics of the triangulation and an upper and lower bound of the lengths of edges, we've got a bound in the number of Platinum moves. So this is in the direction of the homomorphism problem, or for hyperbolic manifolds, that's equivalent to the isometry problem. So in dimension 3, if you just kind of want to see how it compares with the bound that that Mezhitovic has obtained. So for hyperbolic manifolds, at least, let's compare this. So in dimension 3, if I look at T as P plus Q, then it is a bound which is something of the order of, I think that's 11 million into e raised to 83t times e raised to 3 lambda. So it's still not a practical bound because it is exponential in t, but it is certainly far better than a tower of exponentials of height 2 raised to 162 times p. Okay, so in that sense, this is what the bound that we get for hyperbolic 3 manifolds. And in the hyperbolic situation, in fact, what interested me in this problem is that many computer many computer software like Snappy and all, which really deal with hyperbolic manifolds, really work with hyperbolic triangulation. So this is kind of a practical way of working with hyperbolic manifolds as far as computer softwares go. But of course, the approach for Snappy and many other the software is that they're really working with cusp hyperbolic 3 manifolds. So they're working with the natural setting is that you're working with the geometric ideal triangulations of a cusp hyperbolic 3 manifolds, while the result we have is for closed hyperbolic 3 manifolds. And in that case, it's just a geometric triangulation with material vertices, actual vertices. So with my student Sriram, we have a bound for cusp hyperbolic 3 manifolds as well. And this bound now, of course, we need to use different techniques because we can't get a bound in terms of lengths of edges. The bound, in fact, needs to be in terms of the dihedral angles of the 3 simplexes of the ideal tetrahedra. So in terms of, so theta naught is a lower bound on the dihedral angles of the triangulation. And the bound we get is F is some, I think that's, I don't know, 3 trillion or something, I don't know, maybe 3 trillion times about t raised to 6 upon sine theta naught raised to 12t plus 27 by 2. And this theta naught is a lower bound on the dihedral angles. So this is again a lower bound that we get just from the combinatorics of the triangulation, and of course, a lower bound on the dihedral angles. Okay. Are there any questions about the statements in the results?
Sorry, but this measure to which whatever, he didn't have any geometric.
No.
Like
No. Yeah. So his thing is in that sense much stronger because he's actually approaching the original homomorphism problem. So his is not just for manifolds with one of the 8 geometries because it's combined manifold. In the sense you haven't broken it up into pieces. So there is no geometry over there. He's actually just doing purely topological techniques. He uses,
in the sense that what I mean is the lengths of the edges and the angles also don't feature in his bound.
No, because they're not geometric triangulation. They're just topological triangulations.
Ah, I see.
So there is no geometry in the manifold at all. It's a topological manifold.
Sorry, you were saying he uses, can you complete that? What does he use?
No, this is what the comment that you were making is Rubinstein's algorithm for
Oh, he uses Rubin's normal surface theory.
Yes, normal surface theory and this Rubinstein's algorithm. That's kind of the heart of the proof. It gets down to that. Okay, so this is the results, and I was hoping to talk a little about the outline of the proof, but I clearly don't seem to have too much time. Maybe 5 minutes, I'll talk a little about the outline.
There's just one quick question.
Yes.
So when you have geometric triangulation, and suppose you have 2 equivalent ones, does it say anything about the geometry? I mean,
right. So for hyperbolic manifolds, of course, we have Mostu-Prasad rigidity, right? So if I say homeomorphic, then it is isometric.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And in fact, even for low dimensional spherical manifolds, I think less than dimension 6, we have this kind of rigidity. So homeomorphism again implies isometry. In Euclidean manifolds, of course, you can't have this. You could just have like a tetrahedra and you just expand out the tetrahedra. So it's a large tetrahedra. You could have a torus and you just expand out the torus. So it's still homeomorphic, but it's not isometric. So in
You
the,
can go on 5 more minutes. They just next talk is 9:40.
okay, fine,
Got
good.
it.
Okay, so I'll just give a very brief outline. I had more prepared, but I think I spent too much time on this. Okay, so the outline, the proof basically depends on 2 parts, and one is very combinatorial and one is a little more geometric. So to start with, I have these 2 triangulations in blue and red, and I want to first of all get a common polyhedral subdivision. So I do this in the obvious way. I have the blue triangles over here, the red ones over here. I just intersect them and I break it up into polyhedra. Okay, so this is my common polyhedral geometric subdivision. And the first step is to get a bound on the number of polytopes in this common intersection. Okay. Now this is not too hard in the compact case. There are some ideas involved there, but it's not too hard. In the non-compact case, to start with, I was not even convinced that you have a finite polyhedral decomposition, because I thought, what if you have a triangle which goes off into the cusp and the other one which kind of spirals into it? But using this Margulies lemma, the thick thin decomposition, we could actually get a bound on the number of polyhedra in this common subdivision. That's the first step. And once you have a bound on the number of polyhedra in this common subdivision, then rather than going from one triangulation tau1 to the other triangulation tau2, the focus then is to go from tau1 to the common subdivision. So if I get a bound on that, then I go from tau1 to the common subdivision, tau2 to the common subdivision, and that gives me a sequence from tau1 to tau2 with a controlled number of Wagner moves. So these are the 2 steps. The first is to get a bound on the common subdivision. The second is to go from the given triangulation to its subdivision is the bounded number of Wagner moves. Okay, so the first step now, I'm going to talk about the second part of this proof first, which is to go from a triangulation to its subdivision alpha k. So how do I go from k to alpha k? So I'm sure all of you are familiar with barycentric subdivisions, but I'm still going to go over it again. So I start out with beta 2k, and the star of a simplex A is the union of all the simplexes which contain A. Okay, so if I start out with the 2-dimensional simplexes and I look at the star of it, then it is just the simplex itself. And I replace the 2-dimensional simplexes with cones over their boundaries. Okay, so basically this is my coning point, and I replace this 2-dimensional simplex with a cone over its boundary. Okay, I do this for all the 2-dimensional simplexes. That allows me to go from beta 2k to beta 1k. And then I look at this edge, for example, its star is this region. Okay, all the simplexes contain this edge, and I replace the star of this edge with a cone over its boundary. And I do this for all the edges, and that gives me the barycentric subdivision. The reason for elaborating this, doing it sort of step by step and talking about it, is because you can really do this for any subdivision. So I start out with a subdivision alpha k, and then I replace this 2 simplex with a cone over its boundary. And then I replace this region over here, which is kind of like the star of this edge, with a cone over its boundary. And so in order to go from the given subdivision alpha k to the barycentric subdivision, I just need to do this step by step. I look at all the n-dimensional simplexes, look at their stars, replace them with cones over their boundaries, look at all the n-1 dimensional simplexes, look at their stars, replace them by cones over their boundaries. I do this for each step, and I eventually end up with a barycentric subdivision of the original triangulation k. Okay, so this is my process. Now, so in particular, if for every A simplex, R simplex A, let S of A be this region. So this region is really just alpha A star with the link of A in beta RK. So link in this case is just these 2 points. So I'm looking at alpha A star link of A in beta RK. So S of A basically behaves like the star of A. So the aim now is that if I want to go from alpha K to beta K, I need to just do this step by step. I need to go from beta alpha RK to beta alpha R minus 1K. And to do that, I need to look at all the R simplexes and replace S of A with the cone over its boundary. Okay, so this is essentially what I want to do, that replace triangulated ball with a cone over its boundary. Okay, so we want to go from S of A to cone over its boundary by a controlled number of moves. Now over here, there's this new concept of shellability. So I say that a sequence of n simplexes is shellable if my delta I intersects everything up to that point in an n-1 dimensional disk subcomplex. So this is easier to explain with an example. If you look at these bunch of triangles, this is not a shelling sequence, because for the first one, it's fine. Now the second triangle intersects the first one, not along a 1-dimensional disk, but just at a point. So this is not a shelling sequence. But of course, the problem is it's not just, ordered correctly. If I order it in this way, then clearly now it's a shelling sequence. Okay. Now, why do we care about a Schelling sequence? So let's say I have this as a Schelling sequence for a polyhedron. So I start off with 1, 2 intersects it along a one-dimensional disk, 3 intersects the remaining in a one-dimensional disk, this 5 intersects everything else in a one-dimensional disk. If I have such a sequence, then I can look at this operation of going from this triangulated ball to a cone over its boundary. And what I simply do is, so this is an example, you do 1, 3 moves, 2, 2 moves. Now you have 3 of them, so you do 3, 1 move. So basically it gives me a sort of a step-by-step process where I can go from the given triangulation of the ball to the cone over its boundary. And the number of such Packner moves needed is just the number of simplexes in SA, the original triangulation. So this gives me a way to go in a controlled way from SA to the cone over its boundary. The problem, of course, is that when I came across this for the first time, I thought, well, this is such an obvious property, everything should be shellable. But Mary Rudin in the 50s, 1958, showed that even for a Euclidean 3 simplex, there is a Euclidean triangulation which is not shellable. And then Licorice came up with several triangulations of S3 which are not shellable. So in some sense, even the simplest triangulations in dimension 3 and higher may not be shellable. Everything in dimension 2 is shellable, but the simplest triangulations of a ball in dimension 3 may not be shellable. But the big breakthrough came about a few years back in 2017. So Adipesito and Benedetti, Adipesito and Benedetti showed that if K is any subdivision of a convex polytope, then its second barycentric subdivision does end up being shellable. Okay, so although the original one may not be shellable, if you take barycentric subdivision twice, then it does become shellable. And using this, we could show that the links of all simplexes in a sufficiently high subdivision does in fact become shellable, and therefore the original SA can be made shellable after taking sufficiently many barycentric subdivisions. Once this can be made shellable, then you can go from SA to the cone over its boundary. You do this for all the R simplexes. It allows you to go from beta alpha RK to beta alpha R minus 1K, and therefore from alpha K to K. And so all the way you can have this controlled set of sequences. So this is the second part of the proof. The first was just to get a bound on the number of polytopes in the common subdivision. Now, in general, there is no such bound because if so this is a picture of a torus and I have two triangulations. So the red triangle comes from one triangulation. The blue triangle comes from a second triangulation. Now it's easy to see that I can just spin my blue triangle around as many times as I want. And there is no bound on the number of common polyhedra that I created. So there is no such upper bound. Now this does not happen on a plane, and the reason is because any two convex sets on a plane intersect in a convex set, right? And fortunately for manifolds, there is a small enough ball which is always convex. So all I need to do is start out with my simplexes. I take sufficiently many barycentric subdivisions. This is just a scaling factor. So for Euclidean triangulations, this is the scaling factor. All of these are numbers less than 1. So basically this kappa is a scaling factor. So if I take a big triangle, break it up into smaller triangles, what is the diameter of the smaller triangle in terms of the larger ones? That is my scaling factor. I calculate this, and as long as my M is large enough, if I take M many subdivisions, then each of those simplexes now lies in a convex region. And so any two of them intersect at most once. And this allows me to calculate a bound on the number of common subdivisions. This is for the compact case. Non-compact, I'm not going to talk about at all. So the outline of the proof is you start out with two triangulations. When n is more than 1, you take sufficiently many barycentric subdivision so that links of each simplex become shellable. And then you take enough barycentric subdivision so that every simplex lies in a strongly convex region of the manifold. And then you calculate this number of polytopes in the common subdivision. And finally, you can, by the process I just talked about, you can go from S of A to the cone over its boundary. And so eventually all the way from K1 to K2 infinitely many Packner moves. And this is how we calculate the bound. So these are the related publications. And thank you for allowing me to go over time. I'll stop over here.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's thank the speaker just for a very nice talk. Are there any questions? Okay, I had a question, Tejas. This is actually not directly algorithmic, but more hyperbolic geometry. So you had to throw in this hypothesis of injectivity. I mean, for injectivity radius, you have to replace it by the lengths. But is it true that just a bound on number of simplices gives you an upper bound, lower bound on injectivity radius and upper bound on diameter? Because small injectivity radius usually means very high slope surgery on a knot. And high slope surgery needs use these whatever continued fractions. You need a lot of triangulations to go to that.
No, but you need, you can't just do in terms of topology, right? Because, I mean,
Yeah, why not? That's what
I mean, your triangulations could be very, very fine triangulations, right? I mean, you can just subdivide a triangle as many times as you
No,
want.
no, I'm saying given simply the number of simplices, can one from that deduce a lower bound on injectivity radius and upper bound on diameter? So your first result had these geometric hypothesis as well as simply the size of the triangulation. I'm asking, this is actually pure hyperbolic geometry, I mean, free manifold topology hyperbolic geometry question rather than an algorithmic one. But do you know if there is any reason why one cannot? I mean, my guess is that you can have a effective bound on lower bound on injectivity radius and upper bound on diameter simply from the combinatorics. I mean, the number of simplices, that's all.
Or a geometric triangulation.
Yeah, geometric triangulation. Right. It may not
Sorry,
be.
Siddharth, I mean, can't
Yeah.
so for these, for his case, can't these tetrahedra or whatever be very tiny? I mean, he's looking at lengths of edges.
Will
and so on.
tiny tetrahedra fill up a closed hyperbolic manifold? That's what I'm saying.
No, he's not talking about ideal tetrahedra, right? So
Yeah. In the compact case,
Yes, but can they be very tiny and still all
Yes,
the
yes.
angles add up to 360 and
yeah. So barycentric subdivision makes sense. You can take the centroid and you can just do the usual. So starting out with a hyperbolic tetrahedron, and you can break it up into smaller ones.
No. So wait, this is to make the volume small, you're saying?
No, the number of simplexes can increase
Yes.
without.
Yes. But I'm saying, given an upper bound on the number of simplices, do you also get a lower bound on injectivity radius and an upper bound on the diameter? So if you have a lot of tiny simplices, when you subdivide, you'll get lots of simplices. So that is of course there.
I mean, see, theoretically, of course, because if you have a bound, then you know there are only finitely many.
Yes. But that's why I used the word effective when I said it last time.
Yeah.
I think not merely computable, but a reasonably nice geometric bound. I suspect that whatever this space of hyperbolic manifolds, the Thurston's convergence to cusp ones and so on might give it. People used to work on these things quite a lot in the 90s, I know, with these continued fractions for near the cusp. Okay, I mean, there's not an obvious thing. I was just wondering if you knew an obvious counterexample, for example, or had seen a theorem.
I mean, in my situation, I of course need the lengths on upper bound and lengths of edges anyway, because even to bound like how many, when I look at a common subdivision of two triangulations, I would need the bounded length, because you could have like a very small thin triangle, right? And if this is very large, then it might wrap around any number of times. So there's no bound on the number of simplexes in the common subdivision.
For the intersection bound.
For the intersection.
So you also need those bounds.
I do need that for a fact. I know that.
Fine.
That I can't get around.
Okay.
So the thing is, the first paper that's written over here with systoles, we also get a lower bound on the systole length over here. And there are, of course, ways. We, of course, use just Marguerite's lemma, but there are other ways. There's paper by Joe Scull, which is up on the archives. He's a student of Lackenby. And he gets a lower bound on the systole length only in terms of the number of simplexes. So in that sense, but of course, there he's working with geometric ideal. So I don't know, but I would not be surprised in the hyperbolic situation if you, as you're saying, perhaps just with upper bound and PNQ, you might get a lower bound in injectivity radius. Perhaps it's true.
Yeah, thanks. Any other questions?
yeah, maybe I had a related question. So in the cusp case, you can also sort of Dane fill, right, and get a closed one. And so how do your sort of so bounds compare there? I mean, are they related? The proof.
I have actually not thought about that at all.
Okay.
Something, okay. Yeah, no, yeah, this is a obvious next step to look at, but I've really not thought too much about it.
Okay, I see. Okay, thanks.
Any further questions? Okay, let's thank the speaker again. And since it's 9:40, we'll go on to the next. Harish,